And welcome back to Immigration Ain't Easy. And I am joined by Doug or Douglas Rivlin. He is now retired. um, Previously, he was the senior director of communication for America's Voice and America's Voice Education Fund. Prior to that, he was also the communications director and deputy chief of staff for Representative Luis Gutierrez from Illinois, and the director of communication at the National Immigration Forum. He's had a long history of work in the immigration sphere, and he's based out of Washington, D.C. And I have personally kind of tracked you, maybe some people would say stalked you,
Uh-oh.
through social media. No, I've always enjoyed your commentary on social media. Personally, I was just telling you that I really appreciate a lot of the work that you have done that doesn't usually get the notoriety. Like just by being there, by being supportive, by spreading important press releases and getting especially the word out about some of the horrific stuff that goes on in our immigration world. Um, so I just wanted to first off say thank you and congratulations on your retirement.
Thank you. You're like the first person. My retirement was like last week. So,
Okay, so now we're announcing it to well, I would say the world, but to the 40 people who might listen to this. No, I'm just
hello.
kidding. Well, let me just start off by asking you, like, you had gone to school at UPenn and Cal Santa Cruz. Um, going into college, did you have any intention of getting into this whole crazy world of immigration, or how did that all
None.
come about?
I was into politics. I grew up in Washington, D.C. with a very political policy family, and took economics in college mainly so I could understand what my parents were talking about during our dining room table conversations when I was a kid. I learned what unemployment rate was and all that stuff, but didn't really know what I wanted to do except that I wanted to come back and work in some sort of advocacy. And I ran Xerox machines at the 1984 Democratic Convention. And through that, I met a bunch of people who worked for the DNC, and some of them were doing interesting things in DC. So when I graduated, like a year later, I came back to DC and started talking to some of them. And one of them was at the Children's Defense Fund. And that's where I got my start. And that's where I don't think I had any aptitude for communications other than, I read and write and watch a lot of news and uh, learned that I was okay at it, and learned a lot of the skills of dealing with reporters, dealing with things like, advertising and public service announcements, and learned a lot about how the advocacy world works with relationship to communication. And so that's what I started off doing, and have been doing it ever since about 1986 when I got back to DC. And with a little detour to the University of Pennsylvania to get an MA in communication at the Annenberg School, where I was studying with Kathleen Hall Jameson, who's was the dean at the time, and we were studying the healthcare advertising around the Clinton healthcare initiative. So it was Harry and Louise and studying all that stuff. But then came back to DC and got back into advocacy. And a couple of stops later, it got to immigration. I
So
had
what year
met
was
Frank Sharry
oh, Frank Sharry? Okay.
in the late night or the early '90s, and he was coming from Boston to run the National Immigration Forum. And I met him. He didn't know a thing about communications, and I thought about taking a job with him, but then decided to go to graduate school instead. And then a couple of stops later, our paths crossed, and Sandy Unger was the head of the Voice of America where I was working. and he was on the board of the National Immigration Forum, and we got reintroduced right at the end of the Clinton years. So I started working on immigration in March of 2001,
Okay.
which is when Vicente Fox and George W. Bush were talking to each other about a big, grand deal, grand bargain between the United States and Mexico. And it's been a very interesting, wild ride since then.
It was also right during the 245I time, right
Exactly.
before April 30th of 2001. And so you just, like many people, kind of fell into this crazy world, huh?
Yes, I'd always been aware of my family's own immigration story, which we can talk about, but I was interested in this as a communications challenge. Everybody has very mixed views of immigration. They're both very positive and very negative connotations for most Americans. And so it really sets up an interesting communications challenge where, like a lot of issues now, the the way forward is pretty clear, and there's a lot of support for it, but there's enough opposition to prevent it from happening. So we've been in a situation for several decades now where Republicans have been able to derail immigration reform. Democrats have been a little bit lukewarm about it, and like the gun issue, like the environment, like abortion, and a number of other issues. There's actually a national consensus, but it feels like a divided issue because the Republican Party is so deeply entrenched against it. So anyway, it just sets up an
Yeah.
interesting political and advocacy challenge, which is what I've been working on for the last close to 30 years.
As far as messaging goes, and will circle back to your family history,
Sure.
which I think is interesting. But you know, how do you contend with the challenge of the fear-based messaging that comes out constantly from the right, when you're trying to convince the public that immigrants are good, they're good for this country, they're not taking jobs, they're not, committing crimes, rampant crimes. What is like the way to get around that? And is there a way to finally win over the public at large, or has that happened and we're just not seeing it through the votes?
It's always been something that has a two-sided coin for Americans. At the same time that we have this deep romanticism about our history as a nation of immigrants, and we come from all over, and we're mutts, and we put together the best country ever, et cetera, et cetera. There's always been skepticism. Whoever is coming now is not going to make it. And there are too many of them, and they're not like us, and they're going to ruin things for everyone else. And that's always been true. Ben Franklin thought there were going to be too many German speakers in Pennsylvania, that English would never take hold. And he was wrong then, and they were wrong about the Irish and the Italians and the Germans and every other group that's come since then. But the same instinct is still there. It's still deeply ingrained in the American psyche, and it's easy to activate and easy to touch. It's, I think, part of human nature. We're just sort of wary of the other, the people in the other group. And if we can define a group as an other rather than an us, then you exploit it. And that's where a lot of American politicians have gone over the years,
Mm-hmm.
and where the Republican Party has gone full in the last,
Yeah.
say, 10 years or so.
Do you think that, and I'm sure, I mean, my opinion, this has been one of the bigger problems is social media and the spread of disinformation. When, for example, I mean, you see the likes of Laura Loomer. The incident up on the northern border, I think it was about a year or two ago, where the guy drove right into a CBP crossing, a port of entry, and the car blew up and it was all dramatic. And then all of a sudden she starts saying, oh, this is Islamic terrorism. Or Senator Kennedy claiming that Islamic terrorism was behind the incident in New Orleans the past week.
But not just
It
Islamic terrorism,
yeah.
that it's It's immigration from Latin America that
Exactly. Yeah.
has caused the conditions where a U.S. born citizen from Texas, trained by our military in the Army,
Wow.
is blamed for on Latin American immigrants, right? I mean, it's a narrative. They take the facts and fit it into the narrative, and that's
Mhm.
something that everyone does. They are very good at it in the Republican Party, very disciplined at making sure that every new set of facts can configure into their old narrative of us versus them, and we're the ones that are going to defend the us against them. That's the structure of the Republican Party's messaging. It's the structure of Fox News messaging.
Mhm.
There's someone out there taking advantage of you, and we're going to show you who that is and show you who to blame. And if you're paying taxes and you're an American citizen, you're getting taken advantage of by some elite group.
So how do
Um,
you uphold the truth
you,
against that? I
yeah,
mean, what's the because that
part of you
seems
just
like
have
the
to keep
biggest challenge.
you have to keep repeating what is true, but
Mhm.
that's not enough. They've put $1 billion into advertising negatively and falsely, almost exclusively falsely, about immigration in this last election cycle. $1 billion. We just don't have the communications amplification to push back on that kind of spending where everybody is very disciplined and on the same message, and it goes across social media to the far right media that is driving some of that to the more mainstream media like Fox and the Washington Times and
Mhm.
other more traditional media.
Yeah.
And our side doesn't push back on it very well. We don't push back on it very much, and our messages are very muddled. We're not talking about, for the most part, what is a good immigration policy for the American people who are not immigrants.
Yeah.
And we are often talking about what's a good immigration policy for immigrants. And I just think that's the wrong approach. That's not what the American people are particularly interested in. That's great. And some people do feel a lot of compassion for people who are running for their lives or seeking economic opportunity. There is a lot of that, but it's not enough. And immigration is so deeply in the self interest of Americans that they should be for it. They should be encouraging it and making sure that it happens within rules and laws and that those laws are enforced. But the opposite is becoming more true,
Mhm.
that we're pushing back on immigration as a whole because people are upset with what they term as illegal immigration.
Exactly. And what people don't understand is the paths of legally immigrating are near to impossible. I
Yeah.
just interviewed David Beer from Cato, and
Yep.
he has created that like crazy flowchart of all the different ways that you hit different barriers trying to legally immigrate.
Right.
And there's some others out there, but his is quite comprehensive.
But
And
none of this is an accident. I mean, this is
no,
a political strategy.
yeah,
You make legal immigration difficult for everyone and impossible for most people, right? Most people can't. There are no circumstances under which they could immigrate to this country legally. And then you rail against the illegalities and you push against the perception that these folks are different than us, that they're going to bring us down, that they're costing us, not actually supporting us. And you just construct the worldview of us and them in such a way that you're fighting an existential threat. And that is the theme of the Republican campaign this last year, right? I mean, I alone can defend you against the people who are eating your family members, your family pets in this case,
yeah.
and are coming to take what you have and kill your children.
Well, on that pleasant note,
Yeah.
let's reverse, go back in time. And so, where did your family immigrate from?
Well, there's a couple of stories I know, and probably some stories I don't know. But both of my parents had great grandfathers named, I'm sorry, they had grandfathers named Sam who came to this country. On my mother's side, Sam came from Canada and was a college professor and married a woman from Texas. And in those days, that meant that she lost her U.S. citizenship and she had to apply as a citizen in order to vote later on in her life. She had no idea that she had lost her citizenship, but she married a Canadian. So in those days, it was all derivative of what her husband's citizenship was. On the other side of the family, Sam and Jenny Rivlin got on a boat somewhere in the the Baltic nations in the 1800s, but I'm not exactly sure when, and came from an area that's, currently Ukraine, but was at times Russia and at times Poland.
Mm-hmm.
And they came to this country, settled in New York. Being Jewish in that part of Russia was not a long-term strategy for survival. They had 5 kids. My grandfather was the oldest, and his name was Ben. And he was not interested in being Binyamin or any other Hebrew derivative of that, or Yiddish. He wanted to be American, and his 2 sons, one of whom is my father. And then, you wouldn't know that I have Russian ancestry unless you asked me. At this point, 4 generations later, and now I have a grandnephew who was born last year.
And for your family immigrating to the United States, did it provide them with economic opportunity? I'm assuming more so.
I
than
think
they
for the
realized.
Russian Jews, it saved their lives, and economic opportunity for all of the above. But sort of all the different paths that got people here, and then got my father, the grandchild of Russian Jews, and my mother, the descendant of people who had been here since about the time of the Revolution, and connected them up in Heidelberg, Germany, of all places. And anyway, I mean, it's just sort of all those happy accidents of the way Americans move and connect with each other. I met my wife doing this immigration work. She is an immigrant from Mexico and was working for a Latino civil rights organization, and I was doing a media training with that group back in 2001 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And we met and fell in love, and she became a citizen right about that time. She was also got her legal status through the 1986 law, and grew up in Los Angeles. And anyway, it's just sort of all the happy stories that come. It's the quintessential American story, right? We all come from somewhere in some form or fashion, even if we lived on this continent for 400 years or more.
And many of us are mutts, like you said. And it always takes me back to that epic scene in Stripes.
Absolutely.
That I always go back to that scene in Stripes where he rubs his nose and he talks about how we're all mutts.
And that's an iconic and very that it should be inscribed on the Statue of Liberty. It may be someday if it ever survives the time.
Yeah. So that to me, the way things kind of fall in place when you talk about immigrant stories like yours and your wives and how you guys met, that is the magic of the United States to me. That
we do it very well.
Yes.
And we're so lacking self-confidence in our ability to do it well. And people all over the world want to learn English. And people all over the world want to come to the United States. That's a good thing. That's one of our greatest assets. That makes us a world leader. Not everyone can, or even if given the opportunity, would come to this country, but it's an aspiration for a lot of people. And that's really our secret sauce that has made this country so successful. And the fear that we're not doing it well, that we're not integrating people, that we're not assimilating people, that we're losing our language, we're losing our culture, we're losing control, we're losing our streets. Everything else that sort of gets amplified by the far right is all kind of a lack of self confidence in the American experiment.
When you started working within National Immigration Forum, um, I mean, at that time, how like was that sort of rhetoric as prevalent, or was it just more on the fringe at that time?
It was more on the fringe, but the fringe was very important. That, Lou Dobbs was on TV every day on CNN, which was then, the
Pretty
mainstream news
mainstream, yeah.
organization, every evening talking about immigration in the early 2000s, and you had both parties split. You had about 2/3 of the Democrats being pro-immigrant and especially pro-legalization, and you had about a quarter of the Republicans being pro-immigrant and being pro worker programs, so that workers would come and be supplied to industry. And that was a coalition that got us, through the Senate with a bill in 2006, um, and was a winning combination that was derailed by the nativists, the folks who are really against immigration because of the fear of the other and because of racism and cultural fears of cultural genocide, or cultural suicide, as they would say. So, I mean, all of those things have been true about America all the way through. It was true in 2001. I didn't have a whole lot to compare it to, but we were starting off on this issue with a very interesting communications challenge where we really had a solution on the table. You allow legal immigration to happen within channels, within limits, but broader limits than we currently have, so that more people are coming with visas instead of smugglers. You get everyone who can go through a criminal background check and pass to do that, and to get on the legal side of the ledger, so that you're reducing the number of undocumented immigrants in this country to not zero, but the folks who would be not getting legalized would stand out a lot more than the folks do now. And you would have enforcement of the rules at the border, in the interior, in the workplace, that would give people confidence that people were following the rules, and the law was being enforced. And that was a winning bargain. That's what George W. Bush was pushing. That's what the Democrats wanted. That's what eventually all of the labor unions, but at that point, most of the labor unions were pushing for, because that's the best way to get control over immigration moving forward. That hasn't changed. That formula is still the formula that kind of needs to happen. It needs to happen all together. It was what was then called comprehensive immigration reform. And now the chances of getting there, I think, are very slim, because you've had a number of election cycles that have proven to at least some of the Republicans that there's electoral power in derailing immigration reform. And they've derailed it for 30 years.
When we talk about the comprehensive immigration reform, I think it's important to talk a little bit about piecemeal reforms, and why why is piecemeal like not really a viable option, or is it a viable option? I know we've seen the Dream Act in 2010, but there hasn't been a whole lot of other piecemeal bills that have gone very far.
There've been some carve outs, and H-1B, increasing that cap, and making reforms here and there to H programs. But there has not been a overall reform. The whole system needs to be reformed. If your goal is to put it back on a legal footing where the rules are understood and people are following them, then you need to change the system from soup to nuts, as it were. Um, there is an opportunity, I think, at various times to fix discrete pieces. And that's going to be an interesting issue coming forward. It's always going to be a trade off. For the Republicans, it's going to be massive enforcement or other punitive measures to kind of demonstrate to their white nationalist base that they're being tough on the brown people. And that is a requirement of their politics now. But there is also could be sensible visa-based programs or legalization of certain groups under certain circumstances. You could imagine that moving forward. The calculus then becomes for the pro-immigrant side is what we're losing and giving up sufficiently bad that it outweighs what's good. And that was the case. Comprehensive immigration reform was a compromise. Everything is going to be a compromise. That's how our government was set up. It was set up to not be a slam dunk for either the slavery side or the not slavery side. And that's the way our system of government is supposed to operate. We may be past the democracy phase of America. It's a little unclear from where we are right now in the first week of 2025. But during the democracy phase of the United States, that was really the goal, is to prevent one side from getting what they want. And so everything's going to have to be a compromise. And I think comprehensive immigration reform was the right compromise and was a really tough one from our point of view in terms of some of the stuff that was being contemplated. But that's what got the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and SEIU on the same, and the AFL-CIO on the same bill. Ted Kennedy and John McCain, and eventually Lindsey Graham and Hatch and some of the other guys who were pro-immigrant in those days, to work with Democrats like Kennedy and Gutierrez, for that matter.
So, speaking of Representative Gutierrez, what year did you start working in his staff?
2010. I joined in April of 2010. It was just as healthcare was being passed. And that year, there was a fight going on around immigration. Harry Reid was fighting for immigration reform with Bob Menendez and Schumer and a few other people in the Senate. The Democrats had control of the House and were pushing immigration reform there, but not very strongly, because they really felt that Obama wanted to focus on healthcare. And they didn't want to distract from that or create an issue where advocates would be out of line with where the White House was. And I think the White House misplayed that. There was a real opportunity when we had control of the House, the Senate, and the White House in veto-proof, majorities to pass comprehensive immigration reform, but they chose to go with healthcare, which I've had this argument with my brother and others for years and years, and I just think that was a mistake. And it would have solved a lot of the things that came later, because immigration is kind of deeply entwined, even in healthcare, in housing, in every other issue that you deal with. Yep. The Republicans can find some way to make it seem like you care more about immigrants than you care about the American people, and use that as their political card against Democrats. And that's been very difficult territory for Democrats.
So then, was it in December of 2010 when the DREAM Act was up for a vote with the Senate? It had already passed the House. I think wasn't it like a Saturday, and it was the same day they voted on Don't Ask, Don't Tell, right?
Yes, it was lame duck 2010. And the work to get that bill passed in the House, it didn't just pass in the House. Democrats rose up against Nancy Pelosi and said, we have to have a vote on the DREAM Act. And that was raising up against Obama, saying, we're going to have a vote on the DREAM Act. And no, the Senate is not guaranteed to pass the DREAM Act, but this is going to help. And so every day, Nidia Velasquez and Luis Gutierrez and 10 other members of Congress, some of whom were Latino and many of whom were not, were going down to the floor and saying, hey, Speaker Pelosi, here's another person who's going to vote for this if you put it on the floor. They were able to convince her and they won the vote. And then a couple of days, that was like a Thursday, I'm thinking. And then a couple of days later, the Senate voted on it and came a few votes short.
Mhm.
But that was a really important year for immigration. Harry Reid saved his job by leaning into immigration against Angle, well, that horrible kind of proto MAGA woman who ran against him, Sharon Angle,
Yeah.
and he won. And everyone thought he was dead. And Boxer won, and Feinstein won, and the Western Wall saved the Democrats from losing the House and the Senate at the same time. And we knew that the following year was going to be really tough because Lamar Smith was coming in as the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and Obama had not quite found his feet on immigration. It was just never an issue that he was really that in touch with. And we started pushing him that December, right before Christmas, to say, hey, Mr. President, we got to come up with a solution so that we keep these dreamers and we keep long-term immigrants and we slow down the deportations that have accelerated under you. And we, despite the fact that we didn't get the bill passed by both houses at the same time, we know the majority of our party, at least, and really the majority in both houses, support this kind of reform. So let's push. And that became DACA eventually and
Yeah.
became DAPA. That push on Obama, starting in January of 2011 and going through when DACA was announced in June of 2012, was really about pushing the Democrats to see this as a see themselves as a pro-immigrant party every much as the anti-immigration party on the other side was becoming more and more entrenched in the Republicans.
At that point, your role within were you a chief of staff at the time in
I was
Gutierrez's
not. I
office
was
or
the comms guy.
communications? Okay.
I was writing the speeches, and Gutierrez is he really loves giving a good fiery speech on the floor
Yes,
of
he
the
does.
U.S. Congress. That is what he lived for, and he realized, really in dealing with the government of Puerto Rico, that if he gave a speech on the floor, he could get some press around it, and he could get some attention, and it drove the Commonwealth and the statehooders in Puerto Rico nuts that he would give these speeches on the floor of the House because he was against them. He was an independentista. And then, started using it for other things. And he gave a speech on the floor where one of the highlights was, was called Spot an Immigrant. And this was really in response to the 2010 Arizona
SB
legislation,
1070. Yeah.
SB 1070. And it was Selena Gomez and Justin Bieber among pairs. Spot the immigrant. Which one? Because they said, "Oh, we can just tell who
Who's
the
a
undocumented
Canadian?
immigrant is." Selena Gomez was born in Texas. Bieber
Yeah.
was born in Canada. They were an item. I think they had actually just broken up right then. But anyway, it tapped into. He was pieces of that speech ran on TMZ. So he got this to see that giving a speech on the floor, and he did it every week. And that was really my most enjoyable part of working with him, was working with him on those speeches. He would give them, Tuesday or Wednesday morning, whichever day he came back from Chicago. We'd go straight to the Capitol. We'd sit in the speaker's lobby. He'd run through it a couple of times. We'd make tweaks, and then he would go give him hell. And then once Trump came in, he was admonished during almost every speech, saying, "Please don't engage." The House rules are, "Please don't engage in personalities of the president." That means you can't diss the president on the floor of the Congress. And Gutierrez was doing it left, right, center, morning, noon, and night. And at one point, he gave a speech and he talked about it. And I don't know, they didn't hand the guy the card or whatever. He didn't admonish Gutierrez for not engaging in personalities of the president. He came off the stage. It's like, "Rivlin, what's the matter with you? Did you write it too soft? Come on, man. We want to get that
You want to rile them up.
admonishment
Yeah.
every time."
That's awesome. And so when you were in that push for DACA. Like you were heavily entrenched in that. Your office was, and I had mentioned to you before we went on live here that we a lot of organizations, whether it be United We Dream or Dream Activist or different groups, would be putting on petitions online, would be reaching out to your office or Raul Grijalva's office or Durbin's office, because we would get these dreamers, these people who have been here most of their life and came here as children, who were now facing potentially imminent removal from the United States. And our last resort was to get ICE to back down and utilize their prosecutorial discretion. So, for me, it was amazing to see the advocacy that went on, especially by so many people who were not really involved in politics. You know what I mean? Like it was just like out of necessity more than anything else, and the community of immigrants helping one another.
Yeah.
I'm sure you witnessed it firsthand on a regular
Oh,
basis.
teachers and preachers and soccer coaches and moms and dads and lots of folks got caught up in the deportation net.
Hmm.
It's hard to remain legal if you are here legally, and it's easy to get tripped up by the system, and there aren't any real options if you are here illegally. And people would, with very compelling stories, needed to have somebody at ICE go, wait a second, this doesn't sound like a good idea. To deport this person is not in our national interest. And that's the heart of prosecutorial discretion, and why our system has had that as a function of our immigration system, but a bunch of our other legal systems. That when it doesn't make sense, we shouldn't pull the trigger on deporting people. And it's a life sentence for almost any type of infraction. Deportation. Once you deport someone, we're not going to get them back. And with the '96 laws, it became about, okay, when I pleaded guilty, this was not a deportable offense, but now it is. Wait a second, I might have changed my mind and actually fought this in court because I wasn't guilty, or because whatever the circumstances were. It just, the whole system is stacked against immigrants. And part of what a number of congressional offices were doing, not just ours, but we were doing a lot of it, was calling attention to cases where prosecutorial discretion needed to be exercised. That system was working on, to some extent, during the Obama years, and we have not gotten back to that, where there's really a realistic outlet where somebody who's being deported unjustly can get undeported, as it were.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's be logical. I had a case where it was right after the Morton memo came out, when John Morton was the head of ICE,
Mm-hmm.
chief of ICE, back in 2011, June of 2011. He came out with the basic parameters for discretion, and I had a client who basically checked off about, I think there was like 20 different criteria, and he probably met like 17 of them. He was an
Yeah,
elderly man with a heart illness, and he had children born here. He had everything.
sure.
And he went to check in with ICE one day. He had like an ICE check-in, and the ICE agent was ready to put him on a van, or in a van, and send him back to Mexico. And I remember having to, like, I mean, this was like a week after the Morton memo came out, and I remember trying to show that to the ICE agent and getting no traction, and then having to elevate it to Grijalva's office. And
Right.
I mean, it's a struggle because unfortunately there's a lot of people out there who really get their kicks out of, you know, deporting an 80-something-year-old man with a heart illness, and it was,
And it's
it
just not
boggles the
their
mind.
national interest. There's
No,
no logical
no
reason,
benefit, no benefit at all.
but the we don't have that anymore. We're not going to have a Morton memo, and in fact, Trump has vowed on the first day to make the 80-year-old man with a heart condition an equal priority
Yeah.
with the 27-year-old woman who killed someone. There's going to be no discretion. There's going to be no prioritizing, and when you prioritize everyone, you prioritize no one.
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
this, I was going to say, I want to quote you. On November 14th, you stated the following right after the election: the cruelty and human toll that will come from unsparing and indiscriminate mass deportations will be incalculable. And we likely will be able to quantify the economic costs of Donald Trump's promised mass deportations. Let's be clear: Trump's mass deportation agenda will act as a wrecking ball for working families. That
yep.
sums it up right there.
Yeah, and I think uh, we know it's going to be a wrecking ball for undocumented immigrants. We
Mm-hmm.
know it's going to be a wrecking ball for the citizens and green card holders in their families. That kind of goes without saying. But people need to recognize that we're talking about millions of U.S. citizens having people in their families swept up or deported. But what doesn't register as much is that this actually is going to hurt jobs, it's going to hurt wages, and it's going to accelerate inflation and
Mm-hmm.
a number of other things that the American people supposedly in the last election said, hey, we don't want more inflation, we want more jobs, and we want a better economy. And in many ways, they voted for exactly the opposite. Between tariffs and deportations, we're looking at a very, very difficult economy ahead. And you have this constant tension, as I was alluding to. You're going to have and Trump knows it. You're going to have a lot of great people deported with wonderful stories, and those are going to be part of the news coverage, and it's part of our job to tell those stories. And so the American people are going to see a more three-dimensional version than what Trump offers, and they're going to see people they know, people in their community, people in their job being targeted, and they're going to hopefully speak out against it. But Trump is calculated all that, and he thinks, hey, it's worth it for me to be the tough guy, to be to use immigration as the way to take away rights from everyone, right? I mean, they want to make voting harder, but they
Mm-hmm.
use the excuse of undocumented immigrants are voting. They're not, but they want to make voting harder for people of color, or whoever they don't think is going to vote for Republicans. So they're using immigration as a means to go after other rights. Similarly, they want to cut any type of welfare support for American communities. They are going to use immigration as the excuse to do that. Let's raise the citizenship requirements or the work requirements or whatever else it's going to be. Um, and this becomes a way, they're going to get the military and the National Guard to do domestic law enforcement. That's their goal. And they're using immigration as the way, the vehicle to get there. So I think one of our problems in the United States is no, people don't understand very much about the immigration system. They don't really know that much about what it took to get here, or how hard it is. They think, hey, if you're undocumented, you could have come Thursday, but you got impatient and wanted to come Tuesday, so that's why you came. And all these other stories and myths in their heads about, oh, you don't have to pay taxes and you don't have to go to jail if you commit a crime, and all this other malarkey. But they're gonna start to see that they actually are connected to it, and that what got put on their Christmas table and their Thanksgiving table has a lot to do with immigrants and immigration. The phone in their hand has a lot to do with immigration. The way their city operates and the way their office building operates has a lot to do with immigration. The way their suburb and the housing market and the this and the that, it's all connected. So if we try to round up millions of people, drive consumers out of the economy, drive taxpayers out of the economy, drive homeowners out of the economy, that's going to have an impact for a lot of other people, and that's what the American people, I think, are going to learn in the next several months.
In the wake of the election, what was the like pulse on Capitol Hill and like in your circles when you started to realize how many people voted against not only their own interest but the interests of their own family? And I hearken back to this the I don't know if you saw, but there was an opinion in the Chicago Tribune by a young man who is a gay man who voted for Trump despite the fact that his mom had been previously deported and apparently is back here, and he had undocumented family, and he was basically boasting about it. And I heard many, I even had a client whose husband, she had DACA, but then had a criminal history issue
Sure.
and then wound up, we're trying to get her parole in place through the military parole in place program. And her husband voted for Trump. And I was like, what the hell is going on out there? I mean, what does any of it make
He's
any sense to
such
you?
a master con man that he's able to get you to vote for X
Against your interest. Yeah.
when you really need Y, and that is really his strength and ability. Is with the complicity of a whole media empire around him. He's really able to get people to not see the truth or understand what the truth is, and it affects their voting. I think there are lots of Democrats who are like, well, these Latinos, they voted for Trump and they're going to get what they deserve. But that's not true either. Everybody's going to get what Trump is handing out. It's
Mm-hmm.
going to be awful for everyone. It's going to cause a lot of misery. It's going to set back not just the economy, but democracy for a generation and the position of the United States in the world. And this con man was able to do it twice. But facts are stubborn. And getting back to sort of what pushes back on disinformation, well, eventually the facts catch up with the disinformation. So when we start removing so many people, people are going to start to see what that means to their bottom line and why they were wrong to say, oh, it was somebody else who's going to get deported, or it was some other type of criminal, or it was, not the folks who grow blueberries because I like blueberries. Why are we deporting them, right? I mean, it's going to get down to that level.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be a huge government problem. I think Democrats, though, have lost their way on this issue in that they don't understand that they've actually got the more popular solution. They need to lean in and say, we've got the solution that actually gets things on a legal footing so that they're not coming here with smugglers. And Biden was doing a lot of that. I mean,
But do
the
you think that the parole program that Biden had implemented that brought in the Venezuelans and the Cubans and I think it was the Nicaraguans,
and
Hondurans,
Haitians.
maybe Haitians, um, do you think that was a good move on his part, or was it a miscalculation? Because it seems like it fed into the whole Biden's letting millions and millions of people into the U.S. Rhetoric that was coming out. It seems.
It really was very successful.
Yeah.
Um, it, Traffic between ports of entry for those four specific countries declined almost to zero. And that was really the goal, right? We want people to come to ports of entry and have a way to connect with U.S. authorities to ask
Sure.
for asylum because that's a feature of our law. And that was exactly the right calculation. There wasn't enough of it. The CBP One app didn't work great, but the goal of it was the smart one. Let's get people to come to ports of entry. That's orderliness. That's people following the rules, and that's what the American people want.
I guess,
What the
yeah.
Republicans are selling is we're going to have orderliness and people are going to follow the rules, but we're not going to allow people to come to ports of entry. We're not going to allow people, and we think that that's going to work somehow miraculously again when it hasn't worked for 40 years. And Democrats need to be able to say, look, I have a better idea. In order to get tough, we actually have to be smart. We actually have to be generous. And we have to think about allowing the things that we need for our economy to happen in exchange for people following rules and it not hurting the American worker. And even, Musk and uh, Vivek and
Vivek,
some of the other ones that are driving a lot of this policy understand that immigration is actually really important for the economy. Trump doesn't know an H-1B from an H-2A from a whatever.
Well, he proved
And
that
wouldn't know a
last
Puerto
week.
Rican from a Mexican, right? I
No.
mean, so
He thought parole was probation, by the way. I
I
don't know
think
if you
that's true.
remember.
I think he thinks asylum has something to do with Hannibal Lecter. Um, and but he also understands the level of disinformation or misinformation of his audience. So he's not he's not wrong about that. Most people don't know any of that stuff, and we take a lot of that for granted. And we kind of look down our nose at people who
Yeah.
don't know that stuff, right? Oh. But what we have to be able to communicate is it is better for you, the blue collar worker in Scranton, PA, to have a legal immigration system where people were coming with visas and rights, as opposed to a system that is trying to deny that that is happening and push people into a black market. That's what the Republicans are selling. They're against legal immigration. They're against people being here legally. Democrats are for people being here legally. They're
Yeah.
for people coming legally. And that's where the real disconnect is. Democrats, if they leaned into that, they would actually be able to withstand a lot of this and be able to stand. Look, here's an immigrant. Here's any person you want to point out to, including Musk. We ought to have an immigration system that allows a certain number of people to come, and we just don't have that right now.
Yeah. I mean, I think my biggest concern when I saw the parole program go into effect, and it even goes to the Uniting for Ukraine program,
Mm-hmm.
um, what's the end game for these people? Because people come here, when they come on parole, they want to stay here. And so they get, say, 18 months in the United States, and then they have to renew it and they have to do
Yep.
re-parole. But when
It's all a
something,
workaround,
yeah,
and the workaround is nativism.
exactly.
We
Okay.
have to get past the people who think that immigration is a bad thing for the country. They're wrong. Just there
Obviously.
can be no
Yeah.
argument about that. They
But
are
doesn't
wrong.
that leave these people as kind of the low-hanging fruit once Trump takes office and he's like, okay, I want to deport all these,
Yep.
people that just came in,
And we know where they are.
because there's no path for them to become residents here unless they, can adjust their status and get green cards through maybe marriage or something of that nature.
And asylum,
Asylum,
and various other things that they can apply for. But yes, and that also gets back to the politics of mass deportation. Trump doesn't care. He might care a little bit about the Ukrainians because they're white, but he could get an argument pushing back on that.
Yeah.
The rest of them, not really. And he's going to find the immigrants he can find and get rid of them. Again, he's not going to target criminals. He's going to talk about that. He's going to say he's targeting criminals, but he's not. He's going to target that guy you were talking about earlier, the guy who was coming in for his regular check-in and gets put on a bus and never sees his family again. Even though they've been coming for regular check-ins with ICE and going through all the processes and going through the criminal background checks of their DACA and TPS and all of those folks, and that's who he's going to go after. The question is he going to pay a political price for it? And I think eventually he will, but it's up to us to help make that happen.
Well, and I think that we have to keep highlighting the stories that are going to come out, that people are going to be individually impacted. Just like we saw in the first term where people were like, "Wait a minute, we voted for him, but we didn't mean for him to deport our people." Once those stories, we just got to keep getting them out there and getting them out there. I mean,
We
that's
didn't mean to make that little girl cry because we took her mom away. And
yeah.
that video and that audio became one of the deeply rooted memories of the first Trump term,
Hmm.
that we were taking children away from their parents. We weren't writing down the parent's name. We weren't writing down the kid's name. We were deporting the parent and putting the kid in a foster care system, never to be reunited. And there's still thousands of kids who aren't reunited, because the government at that point didn't think of them as real human beings and didn't think that it was important for children to be raised by their parents if they're not really, our children or whatever they were saying about it. And that is one of the deepest memories that Americans have of Trump on immigration. And we need folks to remember that moment.
Yeah.
And we need to remember those kinds of moments when the deep cruelty and the inanity and the cynicism and the lying all becomes very clear. When he stands out in front of a church he never went to with a Bible he's never read and holds it upside down and says, this is who was going to save the country. We need to keep those iconic moments of his con man stature in the front of our minds, and as storytellers, as advocates for immigrant communities, we got to be able to get to those stories and tell them in such a way that it's going to break through.
What
And it's hard.
Yeah, let me ask you just a couple more questions.
Sure.
Um, you are a writer, you're a storyteller. That's been a lot of what you've done, and you've done amazing with it.
I slang English pretty well.
Yeah.
That's about
What have you written any books, or do you plan to write now that you have retired to do maybe some writing in that capacity?
I don't know. I was doing a blog for a while, and I may go back to that. I'm all I know is that I needed to uh, take a time out. That the immigrant rights movement was not moving in the direction that I thought it should be moving, and I didn't think that there was a way that I could get to a position where I was able to move it in that direction, and may never. And so it made sense for me to uh, decide to leave on my own terms, and also my boss and mentor for many years, Frank Sharry, retired a few years ago. He's not done a very good job of being retired since then. But I was thinking about leaving when he announced, and I decided to stay on so that there would be a transition to the new leadership at America's Voice, and that's Vanessa Cardenas,
Mhm.
who's a long-term progressive advocate and has an immigrant story of her own. Grew up in Bolivia, and is the executive director of that organization. I wanted to have a transition period where she was able to kind of get her footing for a couple of years, and then I've known that I've wanted to do this for a while. Writing, I don't know. I don't think I have a book in me, but there are some fun stories to tell. I like this kind of conversation is great. I wish I could do
Yeah.
this every afternoon.
Well, just start
Um,
your own podcast.
I may have. It's a crowded market.
Hey, if I can do it, anybody can. I mean, everyone's got a podcast, right?
I've done a few of them, and a few of them I've enjoyed, and a few of them I really have not, because
Yeah.
they, people that don't understand the issue or do
Well,
understand it
that's
are
the
coming from a
thing.
really
You
negative.
got to have somebody who can understand what, you know, and stay in your lane as far as that goes. Like, I'm not going to do a podcast about environmental issues because I don't understand that.
Bless their hearts, there need to
Yeah.
be environmentalists. I'm just not one of them.
I actually just interviewed and I think you'll find it interesting, a guy who does a lot of wildlife and environmentalist advocacy on the border and about how the border wall impacts the
Sure.
flows of wildlife in and out of the U.S. from Mexico. So
But I
you
think
have,
that's also one of our problems is that we're siloed, right?
yeah,
The immigration advocates are doing their own thing, and a lot of Democratic Party activists and a lot of people who care about Biden didn't know what to make of us because we were kind of critical of Biden. So they didn't think of us as allies. But then again, we're pushing for progressive stuff. And we've got, Democrats on the Hill that are being our champions. So they don't know what to make of us sometimes. And we get in our silos. And I think part of the Trump strategy is to push so hard on every issue that everybody is, running around
divided.
like a crazy person,
Yeah.
and there isn't time for unity. But I think there's a kernel out there of, I understand that when you're pushing against civil rights, you're actually pushing against environmental rights, and you're actually pushing against abortion rights and labor rights.
Bring
And
them
the same is
together.
true for immigrants, and the
Yeah.
same is true for workers on the job. I mean, all of the things are connected, in healthcare as well. I mean, it's just it the same forces that are trying to drive us apart from each other are at work, and what we have to do is figure out a way to overcome that.
In your work through the past 25 years or so, in this so-called silo, in this
Mm.
sphere, um, is there any story or any individual that stands out to you that you would like to talk about, like, something that was really fulfilling for you to have worked on, or have maybe met an individual that you never thought you'd ever have that opportunity to do?
A lot, and I've been reflecting on this recently. And yes, some were individual immigrants with just dramatic stories to tell. And some of it was when you see the light bulb go off that, oh, wait a second, I get this issue now. Steny Hoyer was in a family detention camp. I can't remember if it was Dilley or Kearns in Texas. And we were talking with a woman who had walked to the United States from Honduras and was in a family detention situation. This is during Obama. And his staff member and Luis Gutierrez and I were with Hoyer, who was number two in the house. And she was telling her story. And she was saying, look, my life may not be good here, but I wouldn't have life if I stayed where I was. And my child was under threat. And so I came here, and you saw the light go off in Hoyer's head. It's like, oh, okay, yes, I get it now. There's a lot of moments like that.
Yeah.
I've been blessed to be on a number of really good teams, and to work where my piece of it is the comms and the press relations and all of that. That's just one part of it. But when it's part of the overall strategy, and when it's part of the overall movement, and there's energy around it, and people are all pulling in the same direction, it's just remarkable. And I've got to work with Luis Gutierrez, who's got a great story to tell, and really a riot and a lot of fun to work with, but also the team that worked with him. And I met my wife doing this work, so she's got her own story of coming to the United States as a teenager, not by choice, and then finding a way to make it work. And
Yeah.
she's a remarkable woman. So yes, times a million, those kinds of stories. If you work in this field for long enough, you're going to connect with them.
And if anyone wants to follow your musings,
Eh,
you're on Bluesky, correct?
Bluesky, Douglas Rivlin.
Okay.
It's all spelled out on Bluesky. And that's where I'm spending most of my time these days, to the
Sure.
extent I'm spending time on immigration.
And
And I'm hoping to take some time off and just be retired, but then think about getting back a little bit more into this work, which has been my work for 30 years or so. So
and America's Voice.
Yep.
If people want to contribute to the organization, they can go on the website, right?
Yeah, I
America's
think we're on
Voice.
Act Blue as well.
Okay.
But go to the website americasvoice.org. Look for them on X and on Facebook and on Insta and on Bluesky and on Threads and on Mastodon and probably others. They're everywhere. Their goal really is to be communicators on behalf of the pro-immigrant movement and to help improve and amplify the communications capacity of the pro-immigrant movement. And that's a lot of what I've been working on for a long time.
Is there anything else you'd like to promote?
Should I do a GoFundMe campaign for my?
Your retirement GoFundMe.
No, I think I'm good. I think this has been a
Cool.
wonderful conversation. I'm so
No,
glad
I've
you
enjoyed
reached
it.
out, and I'm probably droned on longer than I needed to, but you
Oh,
can edit,
fantastic.
I hope.
I am not editing this, man. Forget it. Well, on that note, I will say thank you, Doug Rivlin. Thank you for joining me on this Immigration Ain't Easy podcast, which is, I think, very aptly named after our full discussion here. And my producer is my 16-year-old Emma, who I always have to give a shout out to.
Thank you, Emma.
So if she wants to, she can edit it, but she'll probably listen to it and be like, "Yeah, sounds fine." So thanks a lot, Doug. I
Thank
appreciate it.
you.